Alrighty. So this week we're looking at the heart and the major blood vessels. And again, we're kind of moving down the body, down the various regions, and discussing the structures and the systems that are in each of those regions. So last week we talked about the neck and some of the additional head structures from week 1. And we made our way down into the thoracic cavity. This week, we're going to look at the heart, major blood vessels, and talk about the pulmonary and systemic circulations as well. Now, this I know is a review because we reviewed this in AMP1. We talked about the cardiovascular system. So this is somewhat of a review as far as the physiology and just to remind ourselves of some of the structures that are involved. So the cardiovascular system we know contains the heart, which is the muscular pump, and the blood vessels, which maintain the circulatory system. It's essentially supplying blood and oxygen in that blood to all of our blood vessels throughout the body. And that is allowing the vascularization and oxygenation of all of our tissues, right? The arteries can be described as the vessels that move away from the heart. And here again, we want to think about the direction of flow. So if flow is moving away from a heart, that's usually in an artery, and then veins will have flow that's moving towards the heart. All right. Now that becomes important when we talk about the pulmonary vessels, because they are carrying oxygenated blood, right, in the case of the vein, but because its direction is moving towards the heart, we're going to consider that a vein. And even if it's carrying deoxygenated blood, which is the pulmonary artery, because it's moving away from the heart, we're going to refer to that as an artery. So not necessarily the type of blood in the vessel, although that can be used for most of the other vessels, but the direction of flow. Now, if we look at the schematic here on the right, we can start to decipher the difference between the pulmonary circulation, that is blood moving through the lungs to be reoxygenated, versus the systemic circulation, which is everything else. Blood that goes to your head, neck, limbs, to your lower extremities, to your pelvis, abdomen. All of that can be considered the peripheral circulation or the general circulation, and that is going to be mainly taking oxygenated blood to those tissues. So if we look more closely at the heart, it sits in the center of the thoracic cavity, in the middle of the mediastinum. It sits on top of the diaphragm. It sits behind the sternum, so it's kind of right in the center of your chest. It's slightly larger than the size of your fist. So depending on the size of your body and your gender, if you clench your fist, that's typically around about the size of your heart. Your heart has 4 chambers that propel blood. 2 of them are accepting chambers, so 2 of them are atria, and 2 of those are pumping or propelling chambers, which we refer to as ventricles. All right. Now we can think about the right side of the heart versus the left side of the heart. So the right side of the heart, which is right atria and right ventricle, receives poorly oxygenated blood that's coming back from the peripheral circulation. And then it's going to send that blood into the pulmonary artery, into the lungs to be reoxygenated. The left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood into the left atria and then left ventricle, and then it's going to eject that blood through the aorta and go and send that blood out through the entire systemic circulation. And we talked about some of the numbers again in the lecture part of the class, but if you think about the cardiac output, it's about 5 liters per minute. And so in a single minute, your heart and your vessels are pumping and mobilizing almost your entire circulatory volume. So the heart is always at work. The cardiac muscle is a unique type of muscle, right? It's different from skeletal or smooth, and it's mainly regulated by the nervous system and then some of the neurotransmitters and hormones that we've discussed. So very important to think back about the makeup of the heart, the musculature of the heart, and the cardiac output as well. Now, if we look at the orientation of the heart, it has the base, which is mainly formed by the left atrium. So the base is kind of this top general region of the heart. And it's not the bottom as you would be tempted to think. It's actually round about the top. So where we have the vessels leaving, where we have the atria would be considered the base. The apex on the other end is going to be the pointed part, mainly formed by the left ventricle. So that's the portion of the heart that kind of points out towards the thoracic cavity. The sternocostal surface is formed mainly by the right ventricle. So this is the portion that sits right behind the sternum, and it's formed by the right side of the ventricle here, the right side of the ventricle. And then the diaphragmatic surface sits on the diaphragm. That would be considered the bottom of the heart, and that would be sitting on top the muscular diaphragm. The pulmonary surfaces are either side, so these are bordered by the lungs, and these are essentially sitting in the middle of the mediastinum. So the lungs help to separate the mediastinum to where the heart is sitting right in the center of that space. Let's talk about the sac that covers the heart. This is called the pericardial sac. And when you open up the human cadaver and you split the sternum and remove the rib cage, the first thing that you'll see is the covering for the heart, which is sometimes actually attached to the rib cage. And then if you open up that covering, so this is a serous covering. The outer portion of it is a fibrous connective tissue structure. The inner portion of it is serous. So it's essentially having two layers where there's a small amount of fluid in between those layers, and that helps with lubricating the movements of the heart, right? The heart is continually moving, and so in order to lubricate that, that movement and prevent any friction, there's a small amount of fluid in between those layers. Now, if you think about the function of the pericardial sac, it helps to protect the heart from overfilling. So it puts a little bit of external pressure on the chambers themselves and kind of restricts how much the heart can expand and monitors how much it can expand and prevents overfilling. All right, let's get into the actual chambers and speak about the right atrium first. So the right atrium receives poorly oxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, which is this vessel here, and the inferior vena cava. And these are bringing back deoxygenated blood from our head and neck for the superior vena cava and from our abdomen and lower extremities for the inferior vena cava. So all of that gets dumped into the right atrium. Some of the features of the right atrium include the pectinate muscle, and that is essentially the wall of the chamber itself. This is the pectinated wall, and pectinated here means it's kind of fleshy, almost like a fruit. And if you look at this appearance, you can see that. And then there is the opening for the superior vena cava, which we talked about superiorly, and the opening for the inferior vena cava, which is inferior. We also have the opening for the coronary sinus. So the coronary sinus is one of the main coronary veins that brings deoxygenated blood from the heart chamber itself. And we'll talk about the coronary supply, but this is the veins that drain the blood that is supplying the heart tissue itself. And it dumps into the right atrium as well. Now, the other features include fossa ovalis, and fossa ovalis really comes from the embryologic development of the heart. This is where there used to be an opening in the heart. So during the embryonic period, it's normal to have a hole in the middle of the wall of the heart. That helps blood bypass the lungs. During fetal circulation, the lungs are not functioning and the fetus is not breathing. And so in order to bypass flow from going to the lungs, it goes right through the right atrium and into the left atrium. And then after birth, when the pressures equalize and the fetus takes that first breath, that opening closes and what's left behind is called the fossa ovalis. All right, so that can be observed or even felt as a depression in the wall of the atrium. Then there's the interatrial septum. So the wall in which we have that fossa ovalis is dividing the left atrium from the right atrium, and that is called the interatrial septum. So those are some of the features that are exclusive to the right atrium. And let's move on and speak about some of the valve structures. So the atrioventricular valves, these are the valves that sit between the atria and the ventricle. And their opening will be passive. So their opening will happen when the atrial pressure exceeds the ventricular pressure. So when the pressure in the atrium rises high enough to where it's greater than in the ventricle, then the leaflets of these valves will open up and then flow will move from atria to ventricle. Some of the structures that are associated with the valves include the chorda tendineae, which are the fibrous cords that help to anchor the leaflets of the valve. They are connected to the papillary muscles, and these are the finger-like muscular projections from the wall of the ventricle. Essentially, these two structures help to tether the valves to the muscular wall and help to coordinate the movement of the wall, the contraction of the wall with the opening of the valves. They also help to prevent any backflow, right? They prevent any bulging of the leaflets back into the atria when the pressures in the ventricle are exceeding. Let's move on to look at the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is where blood flows as it moves through that tricuspid valve, and it moves from right atrium down to the ventricle. Some of the features that we encounter here will obviously be the tricuspid valve, and then the associated structures for the tricuspid valve, so the chorda tendineae that we just reviewed, and the papillary muscles. So here's a better view of the papillary muscles that are projecting from the ventricular wall and helping to anchor the leaflets of the valves to that wall. There's also the trabeculate carne, and this is this is synonymous to the pectinate muscle. So it's the ridged or pectinated or textured part of the ventricular wall that we refer to as the trabeculate carne. Finally, we have the pulmonary valve. And so the pulmonary valve is the exit point from the right ventricle. This is where blood will move into the pulmonary artery and then out into the lungs. And so that poorly oxygenated blood that was collected on the right side of the heart can now flow to the lungs and pick up more oxygen. Lastly, there's the interventricular septum. So the purpose of this septum is to separate the right and left ventricle, and this septum has a very thick wall. And so the thick wall of the septum is really important for helping us to differentiate the right ventricle versus the left ventricle, and we'll talk about that when we compare the left ventricle. So looking a little bit more closely at the pulmonary valve. So again, this is the valve that is leaving the right ventricle. So here is a axial view of the heart. So we're kind of looking down into the leaflets of the valves. Here we have the left AV valve, which is the mitral valve, the right AV valve, which is the tricuspid valve. Here in the center is the aortic valve coming from the left ventricle. And then the pulmonary valve is right in the front. Remember, the right ventricle forms the anterior border of the heart. So it would make sense to find that the pulmonary artery is the anterior-most structure when we look at this inferior view. The other thing that I want to point out here is that the pulmonary valves are referred to as tricuspid valves. They have two cusps. And so if we think about the difference between the bicuspid valve, like the mitral valve, which has two cusps, this can help us understand how much flow is moving through some of these chambers. The more valves that is located in the more leaflet, that is located in the valve usually determines that there's more flow moving through that vessel. Sorry, the only other thing I wanted to say here is that the semilunar valves are not associated with papillary muscles and with the chorda tendineae. So really important to distinguish these from the AV valves as well. The AV valves, which are mitral and tricuspid, are the only valves that are associated with papillary muscle and with the chorda tendineae. All right, let's talk about the pulmonary vessels. So the pulmonary vessels we know is going to be dividing. That's the pulmonary trunk coming from the right ventricle. So here's where we had that pulmonary valve, the pulmonary trunk, and then that divides almost immediately to give the right and left pulmonary arteries. And these again are taking deoxygenated blood or poorly oxygenated blood to the lungs to be reoxygenated, and then that can flow back to the left atrium. All right, so now we're back to the left atrium. Now we have 4 pulmonary veins that are bringing oxygenated blood, freshly oxygenated blood, back to the left atrium. And so that circle or cycle of blood flow will start all over again. So we go from the left atrium, past the mitral valve, and then into the left ventricle, and then out into the aorta. Now the left auricle, the left atrium is associated with this appendage structure called the auricle. And this is the only spot on the left atrium where we have pectinated muscle. The entire rest of the left atrium is made of smooth muscle. So unlike the right atrium, which had a lot of pectinated portions to the wall, in the left side, it's mostly the smooth wall, and then a very small portion of the auricle is the pectinated part of the chamber. And just to describe the function of the auricles are found on both sides. They're on right and left, and they're just basically extra storage. And because the atria receive so much volume coming back to the heart, they act like some additional storage area just to accommodate any extra volume of blood and to have more space as the chamber fills. So the auricles are like additional storage for blood flow that's coming back to the heart. Moving down to the left ventricle. So oxygenated blood gets transported from the left atrium down to the left ventricle as it moves through the left AV valve, which is referred to as the mitral or bicuspid valve. And as the name implies here, this is an AV valve that only has 2 cusps, right? The bicuspid valve. The features of the right ventricle include the chorda tendineae. So the chorda tendineae are also present here. The papillary muscles are also present here. And then the trabeculate carinae, which we said was the pectinated or ridged part of the wall, is also a feature of the right ventricle. The main difference that separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle is that the muscular wall is much thicker on the left side. So because the right ventricle is not moving against as much resistance, the left ventricle is pumping or ejecting blood against much higher peripheral resistance that is found in the aorta and beyond. And so the muscular wall of the left ventricle ends up becoming much thicker as that chamber has to work much harder to overcome the peripheral resistance out in the systemic circulation. So that's one way to distinguish the right ventricle from the left, is the much thicker wall that's found on the left. All right, just reviewing again the valves. So the last valve in terms of the flow that we're describing here is blood will move out of the left ventricle, excuse me, into the aorta by way of passing through the aortic valve. So the aortic valve is our second semilunar valve, and this is what really controls the flow out to the peripheral circulation. And if you look more closely at that, we can see the internal leaflets here of that valve. And these cusps are kind of pointing down into the chamber and preventing any backflow of blood that is leaving and moving out into the aorta. Lastly, I want to point out the opening for the coronary artery. So just above the leaflets for the aortic valve, there are openings here. These 2 small openings are basically the vessels that leave the aorta that supply the heart tissue itself. So the coronary arteries are providing oxygenated blood to the heart muscle. And as you can see, the heart is kind of selfish. The heart takes the blood from the very first artery that is leaving the heart, and it supplies itself first before sending that blood to any other peripheral organs. Okay, and that's kind of fitting because the heart has continuous job, it has a continuous role, and it's in need of continuous oxygenation and continuous supply.